so you're from there, and you are assistant professor at the University of Calgary in English. And is it the International Indigenous Studies, or?
That's the one, yeah. Global Indigenous Studies mostly.
Okay, excellent, excellent. And Joshua has written a number of books, Full Metal Indigiqueer and Johnny Appleseed, both of which I highly recommend. They've been very well awarded and acknowledged. And you are working on a new manuscript called Making Love with the Land, which looks at the...
Already in number form, or is it just that?
Can folks make sure you're muted?
I tried.
Thank you. Your third manuscript is titled Making Love with the Land and looks at the intersections of indigeneity, queerness, and mental health. I'm very much looking forward to that work. Just a few housekeeping things. So I recommend, it's of course not required, that you switch your view to speaker, that you turn off your audio, that you post any comments or questions to the chat or raise your hand feature. Sometimes if the chat gets really overloaded, then I'll miss people, and I don't want to do that. And we'll, depending on time, work through as many of the questions as we have time for. And welcome again, everyone. And welcome, Joshua. We're so happy to have you.
I am so excited to be here. When I got the invitation that Joanne Barker wanted to bring me in for a talk, I have to say I was extremely fangirling. Critically Sovereign has been just so seminal to all my thinking and teaching. So I just need to thank you for being the editor of that amazing anthology. It's been very seminal. So I'm in awe. So Tantan Totemek, hi, my friends. I am Josh. I always say, just call me Josh if you add the extra syllable for Joshua. Only my partner and mom say that, so I know I'm in trouble. So Josh is good. As Joanne was noting, I do teach at the University of Calgary here in Alberta, in Treaty 7, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. And so I just finished teaching 2 classes today. I have one whole Indigenous class, which is just amazing to me. So yeah, I'm just like full of energy right now. I'm very, very excited to be here. It's been a long time since I've been down to San Francisco, so I'm hoping I can visit when we are able to move around again. And just excited to share a little bit of new stuff with you today. As Joanne noted, Full Metal, Indigiqueer, Johnny Appleseed are my 2 books. I also am an editor of Love After the End, an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction. But those books take over my whole life, specifically my little glitter princess, Johnny Appleseed, who everyone just wants to hear about. And I love him. He's just such a little diva. He likes to sashay right into the middle of any conversation. So I'm going to be sharing a little kind of a keynote from... Oh, I hear Klaus. I just had to hide I have a res dog, a German Shepherd. And he's outside, he's just in the kitchen hanging out with a bone. But
cool.
If you hear like someone going like full shining against the door, that is my dog Chief. So you might say hello too. So this bit is entitled On Bodies of Writing. It comes from my forthcoming book, Making Love with the Land, which is coming out this summer. And basically is detailing I'm a genre outlaw. So I move poetry, prose, nonfiction now, editor. So it's basically me thinking about, one, the cost of writing, of being an Indigenous person. And I would say a lot of Indigenous folks right now, both in the nation states that we call Canada and the US, are very much at the forefront of writing and award culture, and just excitement, which is so great. But I'm also thinking about what does that cost the body of the writer? What does that cost their bodies of their communities? And thinking about something I might be calling like literary voyeurism, I suppose. So as much as I am a genre and form outlaw, I think I try to enact a kind of mode of decolonization, both personally in an embodied sense. So I just don't see, you know, the territories or provinces or the border outlines. And I want to also bring that to the form of writing and essaying, in that form and genre are also kind of colonial boundaries that are inherent within this thing we call writing or storytelling, right? So that's basically the gist of it here. So on bodies of writing, I have long argued that this physical body we inhabit in its zippered coat of skin will always be tied to the body of text that we create. And I think this is particularly true for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, disabled, queer, and/or women, and any intersections therein, writers. We don't have the ability to write simply of aesthetics. I can never write a poem about the shapeliness of a teacup for the sake of the teacup. For me, such cuppings are always bound by political poetics because of two truths. One, that settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy have failed, and two, that my existence has and will always be a radical act of political livelihood. So much so that when I write from the body. Story is attached to me integrally, umbilically almost, and we feed and nourish one another like regurgitant birds. I also contend to think that one is a master while running a master class, for example, or desiring to mastercraft is wholly violent. Stories are oratory even when they're written on the page, for they require animations in order to live. And such animations in Nahio or Cree fashion make story an animate being. It makes story living vocabulary. It makes story kin we are accountable to. I refuse to trauma bond with stories that I hold like lovers. Dare I place a possessive my in acknowledging my stories? Too often, though, such possessions rouse in me a wick that feels like a wildfire. How then, I ask, is storing akin to lovemaking? Let's say, and I use the kind of universal you pronoun in this piece, let's say you find me beautiful, but you are only able to comment on the aesthetic, not the animations of my skin story. What an emptied adjective, beautiful. To say it with merit, you would need to know how the body book enfolds me, spines both of my own and of the book's, engorged and enveloped. You would need my body to challenge you, fatally so, to the point where it asks you to rethink that recycled verb love, and in lieu, ask you about the weight of that noun loss. All while pondering through the lens of a foggy camera or a misting iris, where is the fascinating pornography of the world, and who is its flawed auteur? Instead, let me make a universe of a freckle. Let me focus less on the grand and more on the mundane. Entire bodies of rich stories are written in the minute. I respect in a writer, as much as I respect in a lover, the ways in which languages mix with odor, and I am forever huffing oratory. I find storying is often a series of attractions, like when I undress you and bear witness to your majesty. I don't feign a bow to monarchy, this particular you being European, but rather I ask, how does any single body exist so multifariously? You reply coyly, as if this compliment strikes a tender tendon, and brush it off. I shy away so as not to embarrass you. I turn off the lights and know in the tasting of a vowel on a nipple, the perfume of syntax wafting from the nose and the skin, from the oils in your skin, that a body, in all of its glories, wrecked and steadfast, is alit here in the dark with language, euphemism, and allegory. I trace your body as I would a map, spelling homebound in a clavicle and wayfinding boisterously because I am not ready for rest. This, I think, is an entry point into poetics. Which came first, though, the poetic or the erotic? I am looking for me, but I've hidden bits of myself in each of the yous in this talk, that universal pronoun, and I unfold like a crane, intricately, delicately, into origami or maybe originality. Readers of my work have sometimes noted that they are unable to differentiate between the poetic, the prosaic, the theoretical, or the autobiographical in my works. During my time with the annual book competition Canada Reads, which is broadcast on national radio and television here in Canada, I was often mistaken for my novel's protagonist, Johnny, instead of being signified as Joshua, a quandary for me since the publication of that book. Although Johnny Appleseed is clearly called a novel on the cover, it is readily accessed by readers as autobiographical. Whereas in my collection of poetry, Full Metal Indigiqueer, a text that is perhaps more personally aligned with the histories of my life, my voice is veiled behind the character of Zoa, that book's speaker, who never overlaps as a persona or identity appendage of me as a writer, a speaker, a thinker, or an orator. As for this new work of storying, the work of this book/talk, do I call it biographical, autofiction, autobiographical? I lean towards the categorization, if I must categorize at all within the landscapes of literary productions and academic pageantries of biostory. The work of academia and writing for an Indigenous and two-spirit person is that of continually ghosting oneself through barriers. It is the work of being held like a spider in a web of its own trappings, held tightly within a kaleidoscope of octagonal optics. It is the work of projecting a spider's vision onto its own productions, and from its own proteins, spin silk and spin kinship. I feel I must make my own literary fields, then theorize, publish, and defend them to committees and/or publishing companies. Why does this feel so difficult? For surely others have slid through this semicolon, and yet to me, it feels as if a life is always on the line. I'm beginning to feel one is, the body, the text, the dissemination, the seminal labor, the community formation, the kinship extension. Philip Lejeune refers to autobiography as a, quote, a contractual genre depending upon distinct codes of transmission and reception. Autobiography as a form and genre become declarations of absoluteness that firmly anchor the I, the pronoun, of a narrative and bind them to the writer as the inherent truth teller. Lejeune discusses the autobiographical pact as a suggestion that the author's signature is a declaration of autobiographical intention. The author's signature is a promise to the reader that the textual and the referential I pronoun are one. But I take offense with this pact making. I do not take lightly as an Indigenous writer, let alone an Indigenous person, the expectation to form a pact without consent, that oratories be bound to a page, that page be given spine and barcode, the marketing of biography met with the scalpels and the magnifying glass of inspector and boyer, and my body intertwined in the lacings of verso and recto on a page. I ask, is autobiography a treaty making if the treatise is the narrator as the subject? Is the treatise of such a treaty the desire to petrify and archive? What forms of colonial violence do I underpin when I mark myself with form and genre as glyph and brand? Joanne Saul, in Writing the Roaming Subject, argues that genres are never innocent or naive, but rather are formal constructs implicated in the very processes of ideological production. What of genre and its historical productions? What of the then and the now of language and of contract, of treatise and treaty? Etymologically, genre flints from the Latin genus, meaning birth, family, nation, Old French gendre, here translating into son-in-law, and the Proto-Indo-European genhos, meaning race and lineage, while also sharing a doublet with gender. Is genre, under institutional ideologies, a violent categorizing this way? To be the treatise of this nation building, to signify genus as an Indigenous writer and thinker, is to surrender to a romanticization of indigeneity, forever again as flora and fauna. Perhaps genre is a means of indoctrination for me into apocalypse, into revelation, to be categorized by racial lineages, to be cauterized within the hyphen of pan-Indigenous, is also to forego the historical futurities of Indigenous concepts of gender and sexuality. I refuse to put my signature upon the ledger of genre. I refuse to be X or chromosome. I am Indigenous and gendered beyond Western understandings, beyond sex and nation and nuclear categorizations. Do not take my indecipherability as simply being. And I find fault in the evolution of this form we call autobiography. I take offense in the impulse to identify my writings and that of so many other BIPOC writers by genre or as pulp fiction. Our writings are more than just lignin and fiber. To call genre naive or innocent, as many do, is nothing more than a quaint way of ignoring the colonial imperative behind literary and academic publishing, a colonial imperative that theorizes or aestheticizes this land we call Turtle Island. Do not categorize my stories within this cauterization, this boundary of form and genre. It is a means of division, genre as sovereign, genre as maniac monarch. Making naive the native here is a way of laying claim to the multiplicity of bodies within this noun we call text, forever discombobulated etchings on the treatise and the treaty. If autobiography is a means of authorizing the treatise or the subject, if the powers of institutions through publication and or recommendation can make an author into an authoritarian as a contributor to the genus of our nation's historical literary archive, then in what ways is an obituary also an autobiography? In what ways is self-narration imbued with nationhood? In what ways is autobiography a means of legitimizing and solidifying the ideas and the bodies of Indigenous peoples and lands into the preserving amber of literary national land claims? Official multiculturalism, Joanne Saul notes, insists that the subject stays still, that ethnic subjectivity, understood and contained in collective terms, is always determined by a reference to a distant and often dehistoricized past. Saul is discussing the connection between the rise in biotext through the works of Canadian writers Fred Waugh, Roy Kioka, Daphne Marlett, and Michael Ondaatje, and these writers' disruption of the boundaries and the borders of genre through their literary and political lives, which often takes the form of experimental poetics, the long poem, biotextual writing that layers together travel narrative, letters, family history, cultural politics, high theory, poetics, and prose. I find myself in an impasse alongside all of these writers, although in a different register, as I try to contextualize what a biotext might mean for myself and for Indigenous writing altogether. If autobiography is the poetics of belonging in a Canadian and or American context, biotextual writing seeks to disobey and demarcate that belonging and that subservience. In Nehioiwin or in Cree, we have no word for autobiography. We have the verb mazanaige, to write, mazanaweo, she or he marks for him or her, that is akin to biography within contemporary understandings. Here too, our concepts of auto and biography are braided together through the act of writing and of marking. A pictograph or a petroglyph or story, historical and communally so, because the body of the storyteller is never removed from the bodies of their land base, their river base, their ocean base. Knowing this, I have never sought to call myself a novelist, a poet, an essayist, or an academic. Rather, I have pinned myself to the concept of otachimo, a storyteller in Cree, which may sound simple in English, but in Nehiyawewin denotes in its root otachi, that we are not only storyers, we are also legend speakers, which is to say we are historians and cultural theorists, informers, which is to say we are academics and researchers, we are confessors, we are journalists and poets. If autobiography within Western linguistic systems is an obituary, then in Cree, it is a wildly engendered genre of returning and of revival, of transplanting the past into the future and glimmering in the hope of now. So to that I say, you can find me not in the archives of the library, but in the archives of silt and pickerel from the Red River. I call the now blossoming oeuvre of my creative writing sibling stories, wherein each story has led me to its relations. While writing my first book, Full Metal Indigiqueer, my editor and I removed a handful of poems that were animated centrally. I called them the beach scenes. These poems didn't quite fit with the tone and the overall arc of the book, which is a cyberpunk book, poetic book. But later, I returned to those beach poems and used them as the progenitor of the novel that followed, Johnny Appleseed. In writing the novel, those little poems unfurled into Johnny's childhood and his queer blossoming. I think of Johnny as the human counterpart to the virtual character of Zoa, the protagonist and the speaker in Full Metal. These two books talk to one another, they cross over, they exist in the same literary universe. I've let my stories lead me where they need to go. I think that's my role as an otachimo, or storyteller again, to listen fiercely to characters and simply animate them as they wish to be. And this is what has led me to this current book, inasmuch as the character of Johnny taught me a valuable lesson through their own storyhood. And I quote, "A humility is just a humiliation you loved so much it transformed." I have used this as a phrase and as a guiding principle in my life, in thinking how I relate to my own mental well-being. I began asking myself, how can I be accountable to that which we consider damning? Or how can I be in a healthy and reciprocal relationship with that which we stigmatize? I would go so far as to call Johnny a character so embryonically tied to me as a person that he posits himself on the ledge between biography and fiction. As I wrote about his struggles with mental health, although in a fictionalized and hyperbolized form, many of which are now my own, he became an avatar for me. He became the writer, a way of making material, or at least helping verbalize that which I expertly hid within the linings of my own body. For example, I ask now, how does insomnia serve me as a storyteller if I can find healthy ways to engage with it? How do I navigate anxiety and its attendant waves of panic to think of it as ancestral communicating? Or perhaps to think of it as a coping mechanism for survival? If we animate our mental health and think of its effects as kin rather than parasitic, can we make love to them and transform them too, I ask. I also find it essential to discuss concepts of mental health within Indigenous ways of being, and to think about the stigmatization of depression, anxiety, and all mental struggle in ways that are a gifting back to community, and primarily to Indigenous youth who are committing suicide at alarming rates across Turtle Island. I come to this decision in part because of my own experiences working with youth. While living in Manitoba, I worked for the local Friendship Center, which is a nonprofit organization that runs across the country. It's all Indigenous led, and ran the youth drop-in where we'd teach kids cooking, we'd lead cultural activities, help them with their resumes, and most importantly, provide them with a safe place to convene and to get together. There, one of our youth nearly overdosed on opioids while sitting on a desk. Thankfully, we were able to call an ambulance immediately and get him help. After healing, he returned to the center, and when asked by us what happened, he shrugged, "I just thought that was a natural part of growing up Indigenous." After that, I constantly asked myself, what kind of pain does a young teenage boy have to be in to be addicted to painkillers? Why is an inherent gamble with death normalized as a means of growing into Indigenous adulthood, particularly its masculinities? Is a youth still a youth if they have nearly killed themselves from a self-induced overdose? I hear Ayla, a child character played by Gawanahe Devry Jacobs in her film Rhymes for Young Ghouls, who announces upon witnessing her mother's suicide, "That day I aged by 1,000 years." What means innocence for Indigenous childhood development if our youth age in a sped up register of time that propels them towards death? And just why do we have difficulty around the topic of this youth's mental health? This memory has sat with me ever since, and that is when the stories and mental unhealth I house like kin that I shy away from, that terrify me to the point of isolation, come rushing forward into oratory. I initially turned towards creative nonfiction to engage with these topics in ways I feel are ethical, responsible, and reciprocal, though as I will explain, I have turned rogue within this form and genre, and instead now wear the cloak of Cree as an otachimo. In my previous two books, I often hid behind character to explore stories of personal trauma that were hyperbolized for the sake of plot and or glamorized for tone. But this, I now know, is a kind of violent disservice to one's own truths. Perhaps I come to this book and this talk out of necessity, inasmuch as my mental health, a primary component to my overall being, within the cyclical Cree medicinal wheel teachings of holistic health, spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental, has been so negatively impacted through the act of writing, sharing, touring, and interrogation that I now find myself with no other avenue to explore. I recall, for example, being on tour in Toronto with Johnny Appleseed and doing several interviews with local reporters. As I have noted, Johnny is a character very much embroiled with my own histories and experiences, to the point I'm often mistaken as Johnny himself. Several interviewers, while asking me questions, have called me Johnny, and I've encountered this confusion in brief romantic encounters as well. One of the perplexing things that interests me in the contemporary consumption of BIPOC and/or queer writing is that our texts are readily misread as confession, as nonfiction, as memoir, or as boudoir. While in Toronto, a reporter, having researched me thoroughly, asked me, "So Josh, can you tell me how the death of your grandmother has influenced your novel?" Being a fledgling writer at the time, I accommodated the request and reluctantly retold the story of my grandmother's murder in the 60s in Saskatchewan, at which the reporter nodded, jotted down notes, quickly thanked me, and said goodbye. What has shaken me about this experience is that it was not the first time that type of extractive questioning about personal histories and my experiences with trauma has cropped up, nor will it be the last. And while the reporter maintains their agency and leaves unencumbered by wounds, all set with fresh insight into their critical angle about my book, I find myself in downtown Toronto, racked with grief and holding myself through a particularly intense anxiety attack. It was a slaughtering. I felt disembodied. I reeled against an onslaught of noise pollution, honking cars, pedestrian babble, sirens, the heavy rumble of a train. I found myself in Toronto's downtown shopping mall, the Eaton Centre, sitting in the food court, sobbing uncontrollably, much to the dismay of those eating fast food around me. How can the inquisition for and the distribution of knowledge be anything but a type of assault if it is not done with protocol and or with ethics? How are queer/two-spirit Indigenous writers, many of whom are at the forefront of a new generation in contemporary Indigenous literature, made to be wholly disposable under the guise of benevolence and diversity? How does the purchase of a novel, such as my own, here in Canada selling for $18, allow for a type of permission on the part of the consumer to have unbridled access to a writer's life, to survey our bodies as if we were just objects of curiosity? How does this very manuscript I am writing now also position me upon the metaphorical medical table, primed for inspection and autopsy? How does such a disposability link or braid with our understandings of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited peoples? I must remember that a story can be eaten like a body. Perhaps I mean to say that being a writer under the banner of capital L literature when you are a queer Indigenous person is to create a type of peeping or voyeurism, a stripping, the expectation of the unveiling of bodies, histories, communities, and traumas. Creative nonfiction fails me here, as did the novel, as does poetry, as do the larger boundaries and borders of genre and form. And I stylize and characterize myself and my writings within the webbings of my ancestral and contemporary otachimo or storytellers, in an attempt to answer some of those questions, to unpack these expectations, to lay claim to the sovereignty my body houses, and if I must strip, to do so on my own terms, another lesson that Johnny has taught me. I am laying claim to the sovereignty of story then. What I have learned about academia is that it will accept you into its halls and classrooms, teach you about Gothic and Victorian and medieval literatures, shower you in theories of feminism, queerness, and post-colonialism, and yet it will continually demand of its BIPOC students that we write and defend ourselves into being. In doing so, we provide a primer in how to read our body and the bodies of our larger relationalities. Academia will require of its Black and or Indigenous students a charter into our livelihoods. It will require a ledger explaining the legitimacy and the applicability of our lived experiences and knowledge as having import for what already seems and feels and is an overwrought an overdetermined field of whiteness and heteropatriarchy we call the canon. I am full and burdensome to the point where I expunge and vomit out sentence, structure, and syllabics alike. I lay claim to my sovereignty through the repositioning of form, genre, story, and theory, condensing them largely under the banner of being an otachimo who's slinging bio stories. Being a poet, a novelist, an editor, an academic, an essayist, and having competed in these arenas of literature since the beginning of my post-secondary studies, I've become tired and bothered by these classifications, which I read as both boundary and border. Often my prose is misread as poetic, my poems read as prosaic, my essays read as theory, my theory mistaken for biography. For example, the question I am often asked about Full Metal Indigiqueer is, how should I read the work? This is a complex question, as I do not seek to prescribe meaning, by which I should say sound, as that is what is truly sought after, its sound, to my text. Sometimes I'll joke, read it as boisterously as you'd like, just don't read it in a poet's voice. I say, feel the flick of a consonant on your tongue, shotgun a verb into being, speak story into livelihood. When I say sound, what I really mean is orality. And what I mean in writing this here is that orality is reality. Orality is a sign plump with meaning. First, because it is a sovereign hook, lacing me into those bingo hall snagging stories, or the tutelage of storing in my grandmother's house, where every woman within a 2-kilometer earshot one-ups the other in humor or tragedy around a slab of bannock and a kettle of red rose tea. And second, because orality never asks to be condensed into singularity. Rather, it cascades into infinite registers across time, space, and geographies. Maybe then I have begun this book and this talk in an incorrect fashion. To talk about orality here in this moment requires me to talk about the fall, not of God or of Lucifer, but of Sky Woman plunging into water from a crack in the sky, by which I mean a spirit world that holds a creation story of its own, so that this is but another singular moment in the larger schemata of Indigenous creationism. To talk about orality is to talk about history. To talk about history is to talk about concatenation. And to talk about concatenation is to talk about language. To talk about language is always to talk about sound. Can sound be given a history then? In her book, Memory Serves, the late Stolo storyteller Lee Miracle details the role of orality within Indigenous ways of being, writing, and storying. She announces that the language of poetry lives in the body, and we are always hungry for it. When I speak of bodies, I open this noun's meaning into its playgrounds, the language of poetics, through which we might also say stories, all existing within and upon the noun's flayed innards. Our bodies, bodies of land, bodies of water, bodies of literature, and bodies of community. But this leads me to ask another question. What is the history of the poetics embedded within such embodiments? Again, I must turn to the beginning and defy any logic of linear plot within this talk. We return to creation. Our memories stretch back thousands of years, Miracle notes. We don't think about them until the condition for the use of memory ripens and calls us to remember. If story is the encasement of memory, then the stories of our bodies, our hunger for such poetics, is one rooted within the paradigm of the ancestral. And orality then disrupts any condensation of time into what we might simply call the present. My elders tell me that when we set foot on a piece of land, again a body, we simultaneously experience past, present, and future. Temporalities sing harmoniously between and beneath the print of our souls, tinkling through bone and membrane. The land is an archive, is a library, is a genealogy. A body of land is a body of literature. Water remembers, it maintains memories, it recalls the substances that has previously dissolved. Trees remember, and in their wounds is a witnessing of wars past, diseases eradicated, If the land can witness, it too can listen, and it talks through what we might call living stories, the way a teepee ring would point to hunting grounds, the way a waterway directs one to community or home, the way a petroglyph enlivens communal and historical dialogue. I turn to my linguistic system to attempt to answer myself. In Nehiowiwin or Cree, we do not gender objects like French or English does. Instead, we have animations, which differ from the aforementioned languages because we hold our relations within our language. Where English would call a river, the sky, rock, inanimate, Cree considers all of these to be animate beings imbued with spirit and therefore kin to us. The non-human, the four-legged, the winged, insectoid, fungi, aquatic, all of these hold space, relevance, and importance within a circular way of being in relation to each other, rather than a hierarchical model that positions humankind on the highest register. For this, we say Wagotuin, which translates to all of my relations, a term that many prairie indigenous languages share, but more specifically, it denotes the act of being related and in relation to each other. Here, Wagotuin is a means of existing within communities, continuums, parallaxes, or in the whole of a circle. Ultimately, it is upheld to the active practice of what we call miopimutisuin, or which translates to the good life. Being in good relations and adhering to Cree laws of accountabilities to all of our kin. As such, miopimutisuin, the good life, is kin to Wagotuin, all my relations. Cree centers and privileges accountabilities and ethics within every single speech act we utter. Stories, the original and the contemporary, braid together Wagotuin and miopimutisuin through the active teachings of embodied modes of being in relation to land, water, sky, and non-humans. A creation story or a trickster's tale are active engagements with these concepts and are naturalized in the poetics of Pimutisuin, which is the register of life or the act of living. As Miracle argues, poems move people from where they are to where they need to go to ensure community development. In this way, the original and the contemporary understandings of living or Pimutisuin actively engage accountability, engage in ethics of orality and relationality to the mending of and the adherence to Indigenous, and here specifically Cree, modes of governance. The poetics of Pimutisuin, of living, the act of living, are embodied through an engaged orality that is entirely about the wellness of the whole. Indeed, the very act of putting breath to language, of making sound, is an entry into community-based care. Orality, by which I mean a tool of storytelling, is therefore an entry point into community enrichment and the building of futures through the interlacing of our histories. I would argue that words, orality, sound itself is kin to us, since we not only breathe animation into language, but we also enliven stories through the deployment of our voices and our senses and our bodies. The act of speaking summons words into being through entanglement of experience, memory, and recognition. And stories become communal through a schematic of ethics that hold us accountable to our relations. Here, our words themselves become these animate kin. In this way, stories play a key role in the development, the empowerment, and the futurity of Indigenous peoplehoods. Wagotuin, all my relations, is enacted again precisely because storying is directly aimed at community development and community health, something I would argue that differentiates Indigenous stories from European literatures, which are so often consumed in a solitary fashion. I will state here that although it is against my protocols and at times feels voyeuristic to be theorizing about Indigenous ways of storing and orating for the sake of easing the consumption of my own work, in fact, it sometimes feels like bringing a camera into a sweat lodge, I do so because English as a language and as a form and genres as subsects of writing have continually failed me. In fact, English has harmed me in my stories through acts of classification, demarcation, and analysis. squeezing story into paradigms that often forcibly remove limb and tooth from my story's perceived burdensome and feral aesthetics, which defy and cry against the expected layout of genre. How do I theorize story then? And am I the correct person to dissect our Cree concepts of otachimo or storytellers? No, I am not. But I am also doing so in order to make sense to myself of just what I am doing in this bloodletting on these pages. I have transfigured my definitions of what I am trying to do in this work, from creative nonfiction to theory to essay to biotext, and ultimately found all of these an incorrect fit. Lee Maracle again asks us, what is the point of presenting the human condition in a language separate from the human experience? What does it mean to remove oneself wholly from stories, to write objectively as the inherent and sole truth teller, as we do in nonfiction, or to delete bimatisuin, the act of living, from the autopsy of theorization? What does it mean to relocate and resize Wogotuin, or all of my relations, from an engrossing holistic circle into the rigidity of a peephole, that triage of objective theory? To remove story from theory is to remove the storyteller's body from the body of their text, is to move one into nothingness, into a circle devoid of life, into the dehistoricized Indigenous was, into the closed loop of a zero. To erase, to remove, to calcify for the sake of academia, exegesis, primer, or publication is ultimately to rot an archive in pixel. By demanding that all thoughts, bracket theory, be presented in this manner in order to be considered theory, bracket thought, argues Lee Maracle, the presenter retains the power to make decisions on behalf of others, and the gate is shut to ordinary citizens who seek to gain control over their lives. The closed circuit of theory being legitimized through objectivity and evidence is a horrific bloodletting indeed. Dare I drain the page of ink and blood for the sake of making a bound literary cadaver for inspection? The stasis of an exegesis removes me, the storyteller, from the rivers and the canyons of my story's body, and demands that I hand over the key to such sovereignties to institutions and their purveyors. This is why I refuse theory as a nameplate for what I am attempting to do in this book and in this talk. Bodies exist within their own multiplicities, and the body must stay within its bodies in order to maintain the sovereignty of story. And I'm just going to a little bit here. In Shapes of Native Nonfiction, collected essays by contemporary writers, Elisa Washuta and Teresa Warburton chart dozens of Indigenous writers and attempt to redefine what nonfiction might and ought to look like for Indigenous writings. They accomplish this task by likening their collection and the stories within as akin to the crafting of a basket. Both note the basket, the body, the canoe, the page. Each of these vessels has a form, a shape to which its purpose is intimately related. Each carries, each holds, and each transports. The craft involved in creating such a vessel, the care and knowledge it takes to create the structure and the shape necessary to convey, is inseparable from the contents the vessel holds. To pay attention only to the contents would be to ignore the very relationships such content or such vessels sustain. End quote of that blog quote. Washuta and Warburton's editorial layouts are a stylization against anthologized literary productions of Indigenous nonfiction, which is far too often read in a settler colonial misnomer as representing a solidified Indigenous past. To relegate Indigenous nonfiction to the past is to create and foreground anthropologic literary expectations of the contours of Indigenous nonfiction storytelling. It suggests a dire or a desire for cultural authenticity on part of the storyteller and their communities, and it crafts a spectral essence that we can never achieve, a type of ethnographic reporting, native informing, archaic spectrality. I see this in the so often expected Indigenous trauma narratives, which are now primarily residential school, boarding school experiences. As Indigenous literatures attempt to move away from the over-determined, but the very real history of residential schools, and I'm writing this in the time of the thousands of unearthing of children here across the residential schools in Canada, the literary elites continue to reward and recognize contemporary narratives of these schools. And while I'm happy for the winners of these awards and accolades, what this narrative focus tells me is that these stories are still largely thirsted after by non-Indigenous readerships. And such a thirsting does not allow for stories that move beyond as much as we can do, given our intergenerational traumas and survivals as survivors. We can't move beyond the paradigm of this traumatic narrative. Perhaps what we can look for and see instead is, as Washuta and Warburton suggest, not simply the vessel as a utilitarian form, meant either to teach or to inform, but rather as something to transport and a transformative elemental kin that houses its own relationships and houses its own sustainability. We can think of a story as a basket, as a body, as a canoe, as page, and as living, breathing kin through the passing down of its oralities, or through the lived experiences of the writer's sharing. Both Washuta and Warburton conceive of Native nonfiction stylizations as an exquisite vessel, observing, quote, "We conceive of the essay as an exquisite vessel, one that evidences the delicate balance of beauty and pain. The exquisite character of this vessel invokes simultaneously an exquisite work of art and the exquisite ache. By bringing to the fore a focus on form, we use the term exquisite vessel not just to name the work, but to draw attention to form as a creative and literary practice of reverence for the exquisite in its most literal sense of something carefully sought out. To essay is to try, test, and practice. The form of the essay, then, is a fitting site for the experiential and sometimes painful work of seeking answers. To write nonfiction is to render experiences, memories, observations, and interpretations through prose, a process necessitating writer agency and allowing for emotional depth and transformation, not only of the narrator figure, but of the writer who essays. What I take of this for myself as a storyteller is in the flaring intersections of art and aching. It is in this overlap where I posit my stories as an umbilical space between the body of the text and the body of the writer, and furthermore, as woven from the surrounding larger bodies. The basket as a body of land, which holds a body of water, which is to say that the stories I produce herein is a body of text umbilically tied to the exquisite ache of my physical body, which is bound within the cuppings of my two homes, Treaty 7 and Treaty 1. Moreover, the process of storing becomes conversational, not only with and from communities, but is also a conversation of and with the self. As the narrator detangles and informs themselves of their own wandering question, so too does the writer who writes. Still, I cannot fully call my work an exquisite vessel, as posited by both the editors of that anthology. This transportation and transformation is done solely for the form of nonfiction, even if that form may include elements of the poetic, the prosaic, or the biographical. As well, there are ideas about the basket as a material and a metaphorical mode of organizing and writing an essay that may be considered exquisite, references an art technique that is foreign to my own prairie and woodlands understandings of my indigeneity. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here then. I think too about orality as testimony, because it is often read as such in our contemporary moment. Again, here, the nation state is Canada, pulling up all of these bodies, and just 200 and some were found today. And I find I must unpack my difficulty in positioning stories as simply and strictly oralities. Testimony is a powerful mode of witnessing and listening, and one that we have deployed often since the publication in 2008, the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in the place we now refer to as Canada. More recently, on May 27, 2021, the Kamloops uncovered the remains of 215 children buried on the grounds of the residential school in British Columbia, sparking national movements of mourning and grief across Turtle Island. Since then, and this is not up, not up to date, the remains of 104 children have been found in Brandon, Manitoba, 38 Regina, Saskatchewan, 35 Lestock, Saskatchewan, 180 Carlisle, Pennsylvania, 751 in Maryville, Saskatchewan, 182 in Cranbrook, British Columbia, bringing the current total, and this is dated now, to 1,505 found children who experienced genocide at the hands of the Canadian and US government's residential and boarding school colonial programs. This is in addition to the 4,100 already found through the TRC, and these 7 additional sites are but a small part of the larger pool of recognized residential schools and doesn't account for day schools, the contemporary translations of the schools into our child and family services. As of now, the Canadian federal government has completed and are implemented only 10 of the 94 calls to action set out by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I therefore find fault with the idea that the act of testimony is a transformative mode of empathy through storying, especially given its audience and use, settler colonization. I distrust of the role of testimony within the era of the Truth and Reconciliation for two reasons. First, who was allotted space to testify? That is primarily Indigenous, heterosexual, cisgendered men. And second, the popularization and the expectation of Indigenous residential school trauma narratives by publisher, reader, and the academy alike. The braiding of who is allowed to testify within narrativized trauma expectations has created a dangerous and disempowering mode of being for Indigenous women and two-spirited peoples. I find fault in this synchronicity. I fault residential schools broadly for the current state and livelihoods of two-spirit femme and trans and Indigenous women across Turtle Island who are impacted profoundly by Indigenous men, masculinities, and heterosexualities. I observe the ways in which residential schools enacted harm physically, mentally, spiritually, and sexually against children and survivors of these schools. And I specifically spotlight the role of same-sex sexual assault as an expansive tool in continuing the dehumanization and the demonizing of Indigenous concepts of queerness, transness, and two-spiritedness. That dehumanization is thus further entrenched within Indigenous epistemologies, and we are further sidelined as we continually and sluggishly, as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, try to rectify the trauma of residential schools. As we glacially center and heal the pain of primarily heterosexual, cisgendered Indigenous men, we unfortunately sideline two-spirit and Indigenous women. I find the role of testimony through orality to be a powerful enabler of this vulnerability, given the optics, the hungers, the desires, and the idealizations of Indigenous purveyors and voyeurs who latch onto these narratives as absolute. But nothing is absolute. I try to call this book creative nonfiction, memory work, orality, biotext, exquisite vessel, but I lack the ability to move into public histories, not only as an Indigenous person, but also as a two-spirited person, for such histories have been so carefully and politically removed, destroyed, or as with the Catholic Church that ran the Kamloops Residential School, an authority that has outright refused to share familial and historical records. To move freely into a space of history, whether public or personal or familial, is sometimes to move into a rupture that is beyond and outside of space and time, or into a wound, which is its own place, albeit an archive not accessible and or available. And sometimes that archive is just a little more damning. Thank you.
Wanishi, thank you so much. I always hate moving from the presentation into Q&A because I feel like everybody needs a moment to just reflect and be. So as people begin to think about the kinds of questions and comments they'd like to make, and get yourselves together. And please, we invite everyone to raise your hands or plop questions into the chat. Can you talk a little bit about the title of your forthcoming book and what you are referencing in Making Love with the Land?
Yeah, so a lot of it comes from the thinkings of Indigenous women and Two-Spirited peoples across Turtle Island. So Christos, Beth Brandt, and I would say primarily Leanne Simpson and Billy Ray Belcourt have been big thinkers of that, alongside folks like Jay Simpson, Ariel Twist. But as we've always done, Leanne Simpson's book, she has this essay, Land as Pedagogy. And in it, she begins to talk about how the land is a pedagogical tool. It's also a classroom, so much so it just needs to be unearthed and revitalized in a sense. And in reading that, I agreed so much. And she also has this essay in it entitled Indigenous Queer Normativity, but she didn't braid them together, and rightfully so, as a non-queer, two-spirited person. And so I was very inspired by those. And then also so struck by the work of Billy Ray Belcourt, which I'm just teaching, A History of My Brief Body, in which he talks about desire and queerness in a sense that is kind of urban. And then also just from my experiences of working with queer Indigenous youth, who kind of have this kind of queer flight, in which they feel they need to leave the prairies or the rurality and move to urbanity, into queer utopias. Unfortunately, like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, also Vancouver and Toronto here in Canada, which for me asks a kind of damning question. To be Indigenous and to be queer, how to braid them rather than obliterating one for the sake of the other. And so for me, I'm a born and raised prairie boy. Outside of this, you'll probably hear me listen to like Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn, all the great female country singers, because that just calls me home. And so when I was on the job market, I had no desire to leave the prairies, because the prairies for me are home. And for me, it's a political act to be on my homelands, at least kind of in terms of the geographical, ecological construction of the prairies. I'm in a different homeland than Treaty 1. I'm in a Blackfoot territory, and the Cree and Blackfoot have a very, very fun, rocky history. The best icebreaker when I meet folks here.
Yeah.
Because I get to be like, well, I'm also half Anishinaabe. So, so I would say like that was kind of the general thinking of like how to be and revitalize and popularize or publicize in what we might call indigenous queerness or two-spiritedness in spaces that we feel like we must leave, and what types of queer pedagogies are embedded in the land. And for me, like Treaty 1, my home space, as I was denoting earlier, is like a prime example. So the Forks, which is where the Red River and the Assiniboia rivers meet, and which stretches all the way through to the US, is like a beautiful hub of decolonial sex, I call it, in which all these nations came together, like the Cree and the Anishinaabe, and made post-contact nations. The Métis is probably the biggest one there. And then the language families are, so my understanding of Cree is like very different than a prairie, which is more Saskatchewan, Alberta, because it's also incorporating language families from the woodlands, also from North and South Dakota, the Lakota there, also from northern Manitoba, which is more tundra based, in which you have like, Inuk languages there, Inuit languages there as well. So my language family is like a mishmash of all of these. And it just goes to show me that also the land is hella horny and like also like super queer.
I would agree with you. So I just want to invite folks. We have Dr. Kuhn has risen his hand. Roger?
Yes, hi.
Yes.
Hello, Josh. So nice to see you and welcome you to SFSU. Really exciting just to listen. I can tell you my body was feeling all kinds of things when you were sharing, like just a lot of excitement. And I also wanted to mention like this bit of like even a grieving for like wishing I had your work when I was younger, when I was growing up. If I had something like the way you structure words and the stories, I think my life may have been different. though I do appreciate it in my older years as well. So there's that. I teach a class here at State called Native Sexuality and Queer Discourse, and one of the assignments, I see some of you here who have taken my course. One of the assignments is to read Johnny Appleseed. And since we've been going online, my class is asynchronous, and I wanted to ask you just what your perspective is about how you want your work to be
Mm.
taught, if you will, or to, you know, to disseminate the work that you're doing in a way that honors everything you just talked about in that moment, and also recognizing that um, we're all in this structure. We're in this academic structure, and the students have responsibilities and deadlines and all these things, and I have to hold them to that as a professor. That sometimes goes against what I believe is these indigenous ways of
Mm.
sharing knowledge. So I'm just curious on your thoughts about that, if you have any ideas.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a fairly and very new associate professor here, but in my capacities, because I'm kind of a jack of all trades, teaching theory, academia, literature, and creative writing, um, have foregone so far as I've been allowed the structure of exams. So I don't do midterms, I don't do final examinations. I don't believe in kind of the memorization of knowledge for the sake for the what I kind of call is like a pageant, having had just come out of my dissertation defense. So in lieu, what I do is, and I just remember this from myself and in my teaching as a sessional prior to this, was that I never retained any of that knowledge that was asked of to be memorized for the sake of repetition to answer a simple question or I question, but rather what I memorized in my studies and in my how I kind of practice a mode of knowledge like retaining is production. So I really am a big fan of having my students respond in critical ways. So we were talking about, this was last year in my class, primarily, which was primarily Indigenous too, Indigenous trickster stories, and basically what I was talking about here, the consumption of them. And I had like a student make a cake because she's a baker, so they can kind of respond in any form that they want that they consider artistic, and had all this fondant and was telling all these stories. And then in the middle of it, like as she was presenting, cut into it and offered us each slice. And I thought that was so visceral and effective as a kind of one of like knowledge, and it's like how it moves to the world and moves into someone else's body. Um, I've had also folks do a tracking or videos of their hunting grounds, the trap lines. Think about land as also as an essay, but it's all very new to me. And then in terms of like the kind of dissemination of Johnny, I actually would say so. Canada Reads, if folks don't know what that is like probably the largest literary stage in Canada, in which 5 Canadian celebrities each pick a book that fits the theme of that year. So last year was the book to transport all of us. And so I had a queer Mohawk woman named Debbie Jacobs defend mine on public TV. And it was the most anxiety producing thing I've ever experienced.
Oh no.
So I have no input. But we had met quite a bit of times, and we're actually good friends now. I was just of Debbie asking me like how to best represent this book, and my really only response was just like hold hands with Johnny and go together, and thinking again about the story as animate and as kin. And on the final day, in which Johnny, it was between my book and another, 2 other people were defending them. Devery told this very heartbreaking and heart-wrenching story, which I can't watch or I'll just like sob uncontrollably, in which she's talking about how Johnny Appleseed and working with Book and treating him as kin or as something animate in Indigenous fashion, both for her as Mohawk, myself as Cree, really kind of helped her come into herself as a queer person, wherein she said, Johnny, she quoted a quote from the book, and he had helped her kind of braid her Mohawk and her queerness together in order to kind of return to community and her families as a whole person rather than as a rupture. And I thought, like, for me, witnessing that and seeing that on stage, like that's like the greatest gift of a story, is to be a transformational tool. And 2, witnessing kind of like the power of story and oratory as she was also telling her story and braiding those two together was just like the vision of the power of storying. So like, again, like in thinking about dissemination, and I know this is like sounds philosophical and theoretical to folks, and I'm still also trying to like think about what this looks like in a material form, but of like really kind of taking into consideration ethics and protocols around one's community when reading one's book. Like I can also be a voyeur and a purveyor into like Black literature. So it's almost like when visiting the land or visiting being a guest to another person's, territory. I also try to do that when I'm reading books. Just to recognize myself as a guest and to tread, with respect and care. And then I just kind of bring those protocols everywhere, is that I also recognize, the kind of bloodletting, as I call it, and the labor and, the trauma experiencing and the memories and the joy a person imbues into a book, even if it's fiction, as something I am accountable to. So I would say like, that is how I would like hope in a perfect utopic world of literature. That is how each of us would encounter a book and encounter a text. And maintain a level of care. Like also, like when I'm teaching my students, I'm like, pull these scenes out, analyze it, break it down. And it's just funny to me, like the correlation between that and like, language of the medical industry of like having to autopsy a book, which is a body, which is animate, right? So I'm always trying to remember some of those. And I would hope, in a perfect world, that is how folks would encounter my book, but also each other's stories.
Yeah, I find the more non-conventional assignments and pedagogical practices that you build into your classroom, the more disoriented many of our students become, because the question about what they have to do, right, to get a grade or complete an assignment. So you have to also not just teach the material, but also reteach, what is expected of everybody in that space. It's not easy.
It's exhausting work. I have a lot of office hours, more than I should, and a lot of emails on weekends, because they are disoriented. And again, I'm very new, but this will be my 4th time trying this, and I very much enjoy it. It does, require a lot more labor from me, more time and caretaking, specifically when you embroil the personal into, the expectations of the academy. You're also opening it up space for grief and mourning too, of which they may not have had allowance to do that in a space like the academy. But I find a lot of mine, they're disoriented. They're like, well, what is like, can you just give me A, B, or C, and I'll answer one of those?
Yeah.
And it's funny because I'm like, oh, like you've never had agency in your own productions before.
Exactly.
So that is like the kind of unlearning I think I'm doing with a lot of my students, in getting them to recognize that they're already knowledge keepers and experts in their own fields, as people who have lived through, multiple apocalypses and under the nation state.
Yeah, definitely. Other questions? People are very shy.
You remind me of like all my Creek cousins that go like this when they're shy.
Okay, so we have a couple of hands. Claire, I think, is first.
Sure.
Hello, my name is Claire, and yes, it is intimidating to ask Josh a question, I will say, just because, it's really incredible that I even get to ask a question. It's so cool. Anyway, that was really beautiful, and I'm so excited for being able to read your work so soon. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to your relationship to the Cree language and also to English. So this idea of kind of creating words like indigiqueer to better communicate a worldview or like a way of relating that feels good to you. Because sometimes I think it would be really helpful to learn languages that are not English. So I'm, on the sort of like settler or like non-Indigenous side of things. And I've heard this before about like how in certain Indigenous languages, relationality is embedded, and a relationship to the land is embedded in the actual language. And I've noticed like with words like kinning, or I think it's Robin Wall Kimmerer's like pronoun ki, this is like, I've just been hearing like ways that English is starting to like, new words are coming up. And I'm just like wondering what your relationship is to either English or Cree, and like how that's changed throughout your writing journey. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank
you. That's a great question. I think as you like read my first book, Full Metal, which is primarily in English, I think there's a few Cree words in it, through to Making Love with the Land, which I would say is a good chunk. There's a whole essay where I don't use pronouns, it's all syllabics. Just to confuse people,
Excellent. Excellent.
So I think you can witness my kind of language evolution. But also, like, I'm very autodidactic. I'm self-taught. A lot of it is from small classes that I've taken, conversations with aunties and uncles, and yeah, and then just like reading dictionaries and trying to like put my brain into a mode of translation at all times. So yeah, it's coming along. I'm far from fluent, but I can definitely get by to ask where the bathroom is at a powwow.
Important stuff.
Very important, like that, or like where's the bannock. So I think, yeah, but I've also just been like now, like retroactively looking at how like English always fails me and has always failed us. For example, like in my identity category, like I guess you could say I to put myself in a Western concept, rather than two-spirit, I would say I am, I guess, like a gay femme cis man. But in a two-spirit context, it's less about my attraction to I guess the same sex, which is a part of it, but it also upholds my community duties, which, to put it back into English, might consider something more of like being an auntie. Like I'm very much a caretaker of the communities, rather than, so I guess you could say like berry picker versus hunter. But it's just like it fails. Like it's so simple when you put it in English, where it's more complex in a kind of a Cree language system. And that just denotes two things. It also, two-spirit also denotes my gender appearance, and my sex and sexuality, my communal roles, as well as, yeah, like my responsibility to how I contribute to the community, which is storytelling, right? So like that is already so much more. And it's like, it's kind of slimmed down when I translate it to English versus just calling myself gay or queer, which are just basically markers of attraction and desire for the most part. Queer a little less. But then also when I look at words like gay or queer, they're also so embroiled in the nation state. One only need to go down to a pride festival and look at the plethora of, like a certain type of body type, a certain race, a certain gender, a certain sex, all in the back of the, I guess, bank floats that are actively engaged in the pipelines. And we're like big proponents of the enforcement of colonial ideas. And then queer fails me a little bit too, in that it's less about a certain type of embodiment, basically kind of like, the white, middle-class, cisgender gay man. It's a little, does have this kind of history of revolution and political refusal, but at the same time, it limits me here in North America, because when we think of queer history here, we immediately just go to 69 and go to Stonewall, versus like a indigenous queer history will arc back so much farther than that. Like that's like one blip. It's an important blip, but it's not the full story. And so all of that is embedded just like in a simple word as two-spirit versus these kind of other identity categories. Right. So yeah, I guess I just noticed that English keeps failing me in it because it's too simple and it's too indebted to gender too, to like gendering everything around us at all times, whereas Cree has no gender, which again just kind of speaks volumes to the livelihood of what we might consider queerness now from an Indigenous perspective, at least Cree. So yeah, I'm like turning rogue to English, although that is my livelihood. I do teach English literature in the English department. Yeah. But there are ways, I think, to problematize it and not kind of, uphold it or romanticize it by just looking at it's like transparency. It's like take a noun and you look behind it. There's a couple things there, but it's there's no depth. It's such a its definitions and its histories are simple, which to me doesn't work for me as a writer or as a person.
Yeah. Man Meets, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk again and like for sharing your work. I'm still processing it all. And one thing one thing that really resonated with me, because like I was just thinking about like what do I like take away as a non-Indigenous person, like what and something that really like stuck with me was when you were like interrogating like the centering of like cis het like narratives. And I was just thinking about like, I guess like, oh, okay, I tried to write this down because I was like, okay, I don't know how to like articulate like what I'm feeling, but I was just kind of thinking about like for communities like facing and like resisting genocide, like, and for like, and where like queer and trans people are like within that struggle, like oftentimes like the struggle of resisting like genocide and resisting the state gets like pitted against and like in contradiction to like the place of like, or like challenging like cis heteropatriarchy, and like how like queer and trans people are like too often like shut down as like, oh, like you're airing dirty laundry, or like, oh, like you're dividing us, or oh, like this isn't an issue we should be talking about like once, but in terms of like we should be fighting, or just kind of like, I mean, in terms of fighting like the settler cis heteropatriarchy, like of course it's like is like interconnected with like fighting like the settler colonial state, but that often gets, or I don't know how I'm like, but those get put into contradiction with one another, and like where, and like queer and trans people, I was just like kind of thinking about it like from my own experience as like as a Sikh like trans person, and like within like the Indian state, like Sikhs facing like the threat of genocide consistently, but like as a trans person, like consistently speaking out like within the Sikh community about like the transphobia and the homophobia and the queerphobia in the Sikh community, like shutting it down as like, but I was just thinking kind of, I guess, all of that to kind of ask like, how do you kind of like sit with or like kind of work through like those contradictions that are put on you of like, where do you stand, and like question about the dirty laundry, and like what should be the primary focus of like in these systems of oppression. But like anyways, but yeah, just wanted to see if you feel comfortable like sharing that.
No, most definitely. Thank you for that question. It's very important. I am very much, people might say, a disturber. I get into some hot water from time to time, specifically with my community, specifically with my elders, who tell me we don't have words for queer, we don't have words for this, we can't make words for non-binary or trans, because those are just not words we know. And these are het cis Indigenous men who are kind of running the gatekeeping of the language. But then I'm like, well, we have words for Apple computer. We have words for Chevy Impala. So I push back a lot. So they have like the term, well, I guess like even here in Canada, who are at the forefront of leading grassroots political activism from Wet'suwet'en in BC all the way through to Land Back Lane in Ontario are Indigenous women, trans, non-binary, and queer folks. But it's just easy to kind of spotlight, and this is kind of where the paradigm, but also kind of the parasite of ingrained colonial ideas of gender, binaries, basically, is where these men kind of become the speakers. One, because they kind of corral all this knowledge and they're hyper visible, and also it's expected from the consumer of those watching or witnessing these events, right? So they become the face of these movements that are built on the back of Indigenous women, queer and trans, non-binary folks, which is horrendously unfortunate. It's completely violent. And it's just like, I would say, the active work that me and a lot of folks here are trying to undo. And I think for me, the big argument that I have no qualms critiquing indigeneity as well, as much as I will critique settler colonization, is in the hybridity of the two. And so when we have things like the policing of language around concepts of queerness or trans or gender, or when we have these kind of the primary faces of our political movements, or when we have right now, as we are with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is kind of the privileging of the healing of Indigenous het cis men first, well, we have a huge national outcry for the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And the media always likes to forget girls and two-spirited people in that.
Yeah.
So it's just like, for me, it's a reframing. And I also need to be able, I think of criticism as a gifting, I guess I would say. And I need to be able to critique those who are actively harming my communities and kin. Although I do realize the different registers of danger that are apparent in those, with kind of the social capital, I guess you could say, that I have, I think it's like my utmost duty to do that, versus the youth in those communities who can't speak up against that. And yeah, trying to kind of reslant the kind of movement of decolonization away from a propelling that is just like a mimicry of settler colonization. And decolonization for me looks like matriarchy. Decolonization for me looks like queer and trans-led folks. And decolonization looks for me like not a romanticization of our past, but a hybridity of where we are in the contemporary, which does include concepts such as queer and gender and English. So you might have noticed things like indigiqueer as well. It's pretty big here in Canada. I think it's also fairly large in the US, as a means of like not claiming queerness and then not claiming kind of the violence right now of where indigeneity is at around concepts of queerness, but a braiding of the two as a safe house for now. So I think, yeah, all of those, I would say, are kind of the role I undertake.
Yeah. Lucy has her hand up.
Sure.
Hi, Josh. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your feelings, your thoughts. I'm about 2/3 of the way through Johnny Appleseed right now. I'm one of Roger's students. But obviously I am a white woman. And so my question is, I'm also a historian and definitely lean towards being an educator. How would you suggest, or what are some things you would say for people like me that are non-Indigenous to call awareness to these issues of decolonization, defining settler colonialization, different non-binary genders, and even the histories of, the boarding schools and stuff? How can we call attention to these things without impeding, without being then the center of it,
Yeah, that's a great question too. I was actually just talking about how I am more of a troublemaker. As a new professor, but also as someone who's been in the department for 6 years here at the University of Calgary, I did just get into a little bit of an argument on Friday. So we're like thinking about, we're moving, not centering kind of British literature for the most part in our historical survey classes in the English department. And a lot of the problem that we're running into is like, well, in 1700s and prior, there's really no record of Indigenous or Black literature. There is. It's just like there are kind of ignorance around accessibility.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, look at the treaty. It predates that. Look at public domain. And again, like elder transmission of oral histories is also another type of kind of literature that exists. It's just not bound in an anthology that Penguin or Broadview published. So that was kind of like the argument that we got into. And a big thing about me was just like very Eve talk, like it's not a metaphor, like stop pretending it's just like something in the ethereal realm. So I think like some of the work that could be done from allyship would be to like uncover some of those public domain texts and create, an archive or some type of collection of texts that are historical in a context that can be used for contemporary pedagogy, basically. I know I see this all the time with myself and, you know, my kin, of having to uncover and go to all these archives, and, you know, call up through all the anti-gossip line. I'm like, where will I find concepts around what we consider two-spirit, which is English, right? In Cree or in Dene or in Gitsan from the BC, or Algonquin, etc. Right? And that's a lot of work like we're doing. We need it, we want it, but with a lot of work we do on our own time and on our own coin. So I think like if I had to make any type of like call for allyship around history and pedagogy and education, it would be to, yeah, I would say unearth or find or collect and then center and privilege historical texts that are not just European based, and that are not just accounts of Rousseau and Cartier and Columbus, but that are the stories that were revolving all around those, right? Would be ultimately to be kind of recover and discover the story inherent as a suffix within history, and the multiplicity of stories that are within that kind of parallel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's such an important discussion that you've offered of how tied our universities are to existing divisions between genre and discipline and knowledge and who gets to speak to what. And so anytime someone asks, well, can I teach an Indigenous text? I go, do you have a choice? I mean, otherwise it's just, what are you gonna do? You're gonna read Shakespeare for the rest of your life? on literature, on what literature is, like that's gonna be it.
The Tempest for the 22nd time. Yeah.
Really?
Caliban comes again. Yeah.
Osama, and then I think this will have to be our last question. I want to be respectful of Josh's time.
Oh wow, that was quick. Okay.
I know.
Hi, Josh, and hi, folks. This is a somewhat weird question. I wanted to ask about your writing process, what your writing process looks like, particularly around how do you speak to self and process your ideas and build on them. You know, how do you get to the point where you feel like you're finished with a particular work? Particularly, I think your writing feels like poetry. It feels like a sort of a it connects to the soul and connects to the heart in a really incredible way. And so, do you ever leave parts of your work unfinished as a sort of opportunity to build on it yourself, or have folks that are around you in your communities, sort of continue that work? If you could just give me an idea of what your writing process looks like, that'll be amazing. And forgive me, I don't have my camera on. But I appreciate you for being here, and thank you for the love and the joy that you have brought to me in this course.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming and spending your afternoon or evening with me. I think the writing process is very different in terms of what quote-unquote form I'm in, and I think it sounds poetic, and it's personal, it's prosy, it's theoretical, it's philosophical. Because I just like, if this was like a big terrarium, I just kind of took out the dividers and was like, just grow naturally. Speak how you want to speak and I'll just listen. Yeah. It's basically how it becomes when I am writing, both kind of fiction or nonfiction or poetry, but also when I'm doing essay, be it academic or nonfiction. Because I think, as I was noting, like we can't remove the personal from what we produce, or else it just becomes a cadaver. Which is like a strong protocol I keep around it. So with Johnny Appleseed, like my novel, quick story, like I was writing this kind of Bildungsroman or young adult story when I was like 18 or 19. I was obsessed with the beatniks and the beat generation, but also tried to include folks who were not as they were prolific, but were not as recognized, but like say as Ginsberg or Kerouac, like Albert Saijo was a big part of the beat movement. And so I was trying to write this novel. I was called The Concrete Poets at the time. thank God that died. It was about these pool hall kids who, you know, would hustle for money in the small local bar, and then would go home to their house and like smoke weed until like 5 a.m. I don't know. I was very teenage, Josh. I have all these existential thoughts. And so that never worked. But there was a tertiary, like a third removed character in that book who was named Johnny, who was this kind of flamboyant, kind of queer cowboy, I guess you might say, who was no stranger to assless leather chaps, so I guess I might also say. And so like that was when I was 18 or 19. I was writing this book, Full Metal Indigiqueer, which is a kind of a cyberpunk exploration of poetry and decolonization. And as I was saying, I took those beach poems out. And I'm not a big believer in like the creative writing ideal to like kill your darlings. I save them and I put them away because again, and to me, they're like animate, and they live, they like fatten, and they experience and they feel. So when I had to write this portfolio for this class when I was just beginning my PhD, 100 pages in 100 days, creative writing course. I had to make a portfolio. I was like, all I have are these beach poems. I don't know what I'm going to do. So I'm a terrible procrastinator. I'm the worst Capricorn there is. And so like I had these out. They were very sensual, and it was just like a haunting almost, where this character Johnny just returned 10 years later and was like, I'm ready, give me a shot. So I popped him into these scenes, which are like the intro beginning scenes between Johnny and his lover / best friend Tias in the book. And then it just kept blossoming from there. So we finished, he was a short story for this portfolio. He became a novella in this 100 pages, 100 days. And just the story wasn't finished because the character wasn't finished speaking. I would like often dream of Johnny or as Johnny. So I took this writing retreat and took it from 100 pages to about 260. And after a week of frenzy writing, so about 150, 160 pages of fiction, 7 days of working like 10 to 12 hours from the moment I woke up to like 3 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, the story was finished. I felt it was done. So I submitted it to the publisher. They're like, that's not the ending. So I had to go back and add more to it. So yeah, for me, it was just like this way of being in relation with my own character, who became very real to me and would like take things that were heavy or hurt me and blossom them into beauty with his own narrative. Was very much the kind of writing style. It was very frenzied, but it was also 10 years in the making. So that's, I think, why it was easy to write quickly. It was about a year it took to write that. And then with this nonfiction, which is all about personal narratives, about trauma, about relationships, about my own dealings with mental health, it was different because one, there was no mask to wear, but two, and this is kind of what I think preface in the epigraph, or the finale of the book, is that we can't simply rely on pain to generate or animate our stories. And for that, it was a very, at times, like very harmful and dangerous, almost extractive work of pulling traumas out and putting them on the page. But I felt an imperative to do so, if only to maintain my own role within the community and communities. If I'm trying to actively ask for mental health services, ask for these conversations to not be taboo or to not be hidden, I had to basically kind of like strip myself and be like, here you are, I did it. And hopefully there's a way forward for you to do it too. I'm taking a long break from nonfiction. It's been exhausting. 2.5 years, I would say.
Yeah.
The pandemic didn't help.
No.
But so it was just kind of finding a balance of the fantastic, be it the fictional, be a character that's in love and lovely and that you love. And then also a balancing game between that and kind of the personal memory and memorial extractions that sometimes stories cost and ask of us. So it's like finding the weight and finding the health of maintaining the relationship between the text, the body that you're producing, and the umbilical cord that ties you to it. So make sure that you're always feeding each other. in ways that work.
Yeah. And taking care of each other too.
They're very much taking care of each other. Yeah, there's been times where I've been like horrendously broke, and like the Johnny check came in. I was like, "Thank you, Johnny. You got me. You got rent again for another week."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
been
Definitely.
very, very helpful in my life in that, and mending relationships, and confidence building, and just giving me strategies and paradigms into being happier and healthier in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much for your time this afternoon. If everybody wants to unmute themselves and you have any final words for Josh, or let tons of stuff in the chat. All the
Thank you,
love.
everyone.
All the love in the chat. So thank you so much for your time, and we will talk again soon.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thanks for your time and your energy and your love. And best of luck. And I'll see you in the future, I hope.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Take
Bye,
care, everyone. Good
everyone.
night.
Thank you, fam.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, is class over? Oh, like that was.
Class is over.
Okay, I wasn't sure if we were processing out.
Yes, class is over.
Thank you. Bye.